So this is from Fox News Sunday. This is a Knesset member being interviewed on Fox News.
By contrast, there are videos coming out of Iran of people there celebrating in the streets. I know that you have talked, though, about the fact that you believe the Iranian people, for the most part, are being oppressed and that they actually need to be rescued from their own leaders. Is there any scenario in which that happens? Because there's been a stranglehold for decades on that country where the people who do attempt to step up and protest their leadership there meet oftentimes with very terrible ends.
Well, absolutely. I really hope that happens. It needs to happen as quickly as possible. The Iranian people need to be free of this oppressing and violent regime. I mean, if you look around the world, those marches that you see in support of Israel, the Jewish community are marching hand in hand with Iranian communities, with Iranian refugees, because they understand the real force and the biggest instigator of terror in the Middle East and in the rest of the world, which is Iran. And we have a mutual goal, and it is to fight it together. I mean, Iran is attacking not just Israel. Iran is the most destabilizing force that we have. It's attacking our values. This is radical Islamist regime that's attacking our values, the way that we live, our liberties, our freedom, and it has to be stopped. If this attack from last night would have happened to any other country, the results would have been devastating with probably thousands of dead. And I think that that's a proof for the rest of the world how important it is for all of us to stand together against this violent and devil regime.
Well, we know Israel is facing threats on many, many fronts. Knesset member Sharon Haskell, we thank you for your time.
So there, devil regime, yeah.
So, here's the sort of dichotomy that we were accustomed to seeing in the Western narrative in general, which is good and bad. These are the good guys and these are the bad guys. And what's funny about it is it's not actually the actions that are being judged as to whether or not you're good or bad. Because if the point that's being made is, again, and you saw this in this interview too, Iran's attack could have killed civilians. It didn't. It could have. Well, if that's what deems you bad, then Israel seems like a super bad guy right now because they've actually killed thousands of people. The US has unleashed many wars in the region. I think the numbers on the war on terror are something like just direct death is like 1 million people. If you look at secondary reasons for death, the number goes up. So it's not the actions that deems whether or not someone is the good guy or the bad guy in these absolute terms. It's just who it is. It's just there's a system of power that exists, and the state that's the biggest power, which is the US, deems itself the good guy. Anybody it wants becomes the good guy, and everybody it doesn't like becomes the bad guy. And that's why you see this sort of disdain for international law and the international system. It doesn't really matter because what law is whatever we say, because we're the ones in power and we can make that decision. So it's not that I would say, and I would avoid this, and I think sometimes this happens, is the adversaries of the US then become these like heroic figures. Yeah. And I think that's problematic as well, because there are the Iranian people themselves have very legitimate reasons why they object to the current government. The problem is, if you want to hold the Islamic Republic accountable, you have to have a system of accountability. And we are the ones who are undermining that system of accountability as we speak. So one of the reasons why advocates of international law are so frustrated and so angry at what we've seen in the last 6 months is that you are watching the supposed champions of that system tear it to shreds. You cannot hold only selective states accountable. Everybody has to be held accountable under that system. And that's why it's so important to hold Israel accountable, so that you can hold Iran accountable.
And of course, I would say sanctions don't help anyone.
Certainly not the way that they are used by the US, right? The broad-based sanctions that impoverish an entire, that amount to collective punishment are not an actual strategy that brings about the change. And they're not effective, right? They're effective in very specific situations, but most of the time, the way that sanctions are used are entirely ineffective, and they actually end up hurting the civilian population rather than their target,
Right.
which is the leadership. And that's
Yeah.
certainly been the case in Iran.
What other kind of myths do you think that there are that are worth debunking?
I think one of the things that's very interesting is Iran is, and this is sort of an Orientalist trope, Iran is often depicted, the Islamic Republic specifically, is often depicted as this sort of all-powerful entity that's, a puppet master, and it's everything that happens is Iran backed, and they tell everybody what to do, and they've infiltrated our institutions, and this is the way that it's depicted. And at the same time, it's on the verge of collapse if we just slap on another sanction, right? Just a few more sanctions, and they're very fragile, and they're about to collapse. The reality is somewhere much more in the middle. There's certainly domestic pressure within the country because there's a lot of dissatisfaction, especially among the youth, with the system entirely, with the system, the way it functions, its political repression, its social repressions, and of course, the dire economic situation in which they find themselves in, which is in part responsible for the state itself because of its mismanagement and corruption, but also because of US sanctions, right? There's no way of disentangling the economic situation in Iran from the fact that it's under, up until 2 years ago, the heaviest sanctions of any country in the world. Right now it's Russia. So I think that sometimes those narratives, and the reason why you can see these very extreme opposite narratives, serve a purpose politically, and that's why we hear them, right? Iran is all powerful when we want to say they're the bad guys. Iran is very, very weak and on the verge of collapse when we want to advocate for things like regime change or more sanctions or more pressure policies. Whereas if we understood that there's something much more in the middle, then we would have policies in place that would actually understand how to interact with that state. And I'll give you one just concrete example, and I know we're running out of time. One of the discussions leading up to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal in the US was that, and these were Iran hawks, right? The ones who didn't want any diplomacy with Iran. Iran couldn't be trusted. Iran will never negotiate with the US. Iran will never abide by a deal. These were very common sort of rhetoric that was used. We now have, as factual evidence, all of that is incorrect. Iran negotiated with the US, came to an agreement, and abided by that agreement. And this was certified by both the Obama and the Trump administration, which pulled out of the deal. So that rhetoric doesn't match the reality on the ground. And it leads to situations that we find ourselves in today, which is you have an administration that pulled out of the deal. You have another administration, the Biden administration, which never went back to the deal. And now we have more tension with a country that is, whether we like it or not, one of the major powers within the region. And it exists and it's there. And this is the current government. And so, we can live in a sort of fantasy that says this is not the reality on the ground, but it is. And in order to have peaceful coexistence, in order for our own national security interests to be served, we have to understand what's actually going on there.